Hello, thanks for tuning in. Today's lesson is all about missing what is right underneath your nose. But first, a story from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find the body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. Now he was at the table with them. He took bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This story is one of several where Jesus appears after his death to the disciples or to some of the disciple women that would follow him around throughout the course of his ministry. And a story in which, for some reason that's mysterious, they don't recognize him. Right in front of them, they don't recognize their friend, the Christ. And so for a time, they miss it until their eyes are open to the reality that's right in front of them. But the story also invites you to imagine it for yourself and what it might be like if you found yourself on the road with Jesus. Imagine you were walking from one place to another, maybe for exercise, or maybe you had some place that you had to be, or maybe going between golf greens on a game of golf, or to your next class if you were a student, or to some important meeting or appointment, when suddenly you find that you're not alone. You look up and there is somebody walking alongside you, and lo and behold, it's Jesus. Somehow you just know that it's Jesus, matching you stride for stride. How would you conduct yourself? How much worse would it be if you were walking with a friend and had just been telling the punchline to a joke that, let's say, is PG-13, and right as you conclude the joke, your friend looks sort of ashen-faced, and you're like, "Come on, man, it's at least a little funny." He nods over here, and you notice that Jesus is standing there going, So in shock and surprise, you inquire, "How much of that did you hear?" Or maybe you just let it go and hope for the best and clear your throat and say, "Welcome, Rabbi. To what do we owe this honor?" You see, if it were me, I'd be trying to put my best foot forward. You're walking with one of the most, if not the most famous person in history, after all. And even if you didn't regularly attend church, you'd know that this is kind of a big deal. If it were me, I would treat Jesus with the utmost respect. I'd offer him a drink. I'd pepper him with anxious concerns. Are you tired? Do you need some rest? Are we walking too fast? Are you hot? Are you cold? Do you need to borrow my coat? My cell phone? Never used one? Well, you can keep mine. No, really, it's no problem. I have another. And Jesus responds, 2 cell phones? Maybe then I'd respond back, you'd understand if you were a millennial in the year 2020. I'll just fire up my old phone. It's just sitting in my drawer. The experience would not be unlike those moments when you found yourself unexpectedly in the presence of a great person. Someone says, "Who's that?" And someone else says, "Yeah, it is. It's him. It's that famous athlete, famous actor, politician, who knows?" And you say, "Whoa, you're right. And boy, that camera really takes off 10 pounds. Should we ask for their autograph?" And your friend says, no, leave them alone. They probably just want to be treated like a normal person. After all, they put on their pants just like anyone else, one leg and then the other. Except everyone knows that your friend is full of it. Of course they aren't like everyone else. That's what makes them famous. That's why the excitement in the room changes the moment that they're recognized. What I usually do in such circumstances is try to play it cool, whilst also trying to impress the famous person in some backhanded way, often under the delusion that if they just got to know me, we'd probably become best friends. Don't you wish you had a famous friend? Well, the disciples had a famous friend, but he died. And this is the problem that the disciples find themselves in this story. And they're walking down the road, and the text reads that they're talking with each other about all the things that had happened. This word rendered talking in English can imply different things. For example, if you were talking with your mom on the phone, you might use the word talking to describe what's going on, or maybe an everyday conversation about your kids or about the pets or about weekend plans. But sometimes talking means exchanging words about something that is of particular importance. Sometimes we can use the word talk to say, "I need to talk to you," meaning come down to my office. We have some weighty things to discuss. Or if somebody who you love very much, maybe a spouse or significant other, says, "Can we talk?" Well, then that word talk that can be used so flippantly when talking about the weather takes on heavier, weightier meaning. Well, in this instance, this word translated as talk comes from the Greek word homileu. Homileu. This word implies that they are having a deep, intimate conversation, which is why in the old King James Version, they translated this word as communion. So let me read the passage in the King James just to give you the idea. And they talked, homileu, deep, intimate conversation. They had deep, intimate conversation together of all these things which had happened. And it came to pass that while they communed, same word, translated different, to hint at the intimacy that is implied at this conversation. When they communed together and reasoned, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. And the interpreters of the King James understood that this word implies that they are engaged in an intimate, deep, important conversation about the most important things. It turns out that the word homily, another word for sermon, comes from the same Greek word, but it's also the same word that through history has been translated as communion, that time where we break bread together in an intimate, close, and personal way. A time where we sometimes even go forward to the front of the sanctuary in a very vulnerable way. So they're talking in this way about what has happened in Jerusalem, and they're talking about Jesus' death and about the rumors that are flying around concerning his resurrection, but they don't recognize him. That's part of what makes this passage fun. For some reason, they just can't see it. What's right under their nose. They're talking about Jesus, and yet they don't know they're with Jesus. It'd be as if you were talking about a famous person with that person whilst you are unawares. Jesus asked them, what are you talking about while you walk along? And they say, are you the only one who doesn't know about the things that have happened in Jerusalem? Jesus says, what things? And so they recount the events of the last 3 days, about Jesus' crucifixion, and about now there's some women, these crazy women, they would imply, that are saying things about an empty tomb and implying that Jesus has risen. And so they're just all sorts of confused. There's a lot at stake here. If the report of the women is accurate, then this is unbelievable news. The disciples admit their hopes for Jesus, that he would be the savior of their people, but their hopes have been dashed to bits now that Jesus has died. But what if he has been risen from the dead? That would change things. What might this mean? It's even hard to say. So this first proclamation of the Easter message by the women would mean that hope was not lost. And that's a hard pill to swallow if you are hopeless, because putting your hope in something only to be disappointed again is almost more painful than being disappointed the first time. So this is why they are walking, and Jesus finds them looking sad. They miss the friend. They miss the presence of Christ in their midst. If only they knew that they were in the very presence of the one whose help they sought. But you don't even need to read into the disciples' response to Jesus' question. All you need to do is go back a few verses to verse 11 and read how the disciples responded to the message of the women when they came back running from the tomb. They seem a little doubtful, or very doubtful, in the passage that we read today, but just a few verses earlier, they are absolutely incredulous at the claims of Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, as they are listed in Luke's gospel. And the text reads that it seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Now, this Greek word, translated in verses 10 and 11 as idle tale, what word is it? Well, it's not hamaleu. It's not the Greek word that hints at a deep and intimate conversation. It's another word called leiros, which means simply that, idle chatter, blithering away, rambling, pointless talk. And that's how the conversation of the women who first told the story is described, as if they were saying something very silly from an hysterical and confused vantage point. Pretty classic. How would it have been if the men in their life had listened to them the first time they claimed to see what they saw? Well, things might have been a little different. But Jesus responds back to them with this rebuke. He says, "How foolish you are, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared." Now, Jesus is describing the disciples as pretty ignorant and foolish by saying slow of heart. It was thought back then that the heart was where you did your thinking. They didn't know at that time that it was the brain that you did your thinking, and so they thought that the heart was where all of the thoughts were generated. And so this is why when we read about Mary pondering things in her heart at the beginning of this gospel concerning the things that she learned from the angel, she's thinking about it. She's really mulling it over. And Jesus calls the disciples slow of heart and basically saying, you're pretty dim-witted. You ought to know better. After all, Christ is right under their nose and they still can't see it. But even before they get to this point where they're on the road to Emmaus, he had probably read from Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and the Psalms, one story after another of God's redemptive power and the hope that the people can have even whilst they are in exile for a better future, of hope for cut down trees, that maybe even some sprouts might come up in a new tree, new life on the other side of what appears to be dead. These are the stories that they had carried with them in their tradition, and these are the stories that Jesus would have told them. Maybe Jesus years ago began with the story of Moses, telling of the liberation from Egypt. And you can imagine Jesus turning to the disciples saying, if God can do that, why shouldn't the story told by the women about the empty tomb be true? Use your heads, or in this case, hearts, and think about it for a moment. Have faith in God. Well, things carry on like this for a few miles until they arrive at the place that the disciples intend to stay for the evening. And Jesus seems to be wanting to continue on the way, but the disciples implore him to stay because it's so late. And so Jesus decides to stay. And remember, they still don't know who Jesus is. They're just showing kindness to a stranger, which is something else that we could learn from. And then suddenly, everything changes when they sit down for a meal. You could see this as an extension of the intimate conversation. There are very few places more intimate than the table. Place where you sit across from the people you love or from strangers, but eat from the same loaf of bread. Slice of meat cut from the same meatloaf. Everyone eating from the same plate, in a manner of speaking. So Jesus is around the table, and the text reads that he takes bread. This should be very familiar for church folks. Takes bread, blesses it, and breaks it, and passes it out to his disciples. It's exactly how it's phrased. And then as soon as this happens, the text reads, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. And then he vanishes from their sight. Poof. So they catch a glimpse, and then off he goes. So often the case with the profound, deep truths. Catch a glimpse, and then you kind of half forget what you learned in that moment of clarity. But read carefully. It doesn't say that Jesus left. He just disappears. The sight that they had is no longer. And here we see a pattern that will repeat itself countless times throughout the history of the church. Remember, we began this intimate talk, this homily, this communion that we're having through this digital forum with the question, how would it be if you suddenly found yourself to be on the road with Jesus? How would you speak? What would you talk about? How would you conduct yourself? And it's an interesting question to consider, but if we are to consider the full implications of this story, the fact of the matter is, we have already been walking with Jesus, whether we had the eyes to see it or not. And in many cases, we simply haven't had the eyes to see Christ. We've been, in our own way, foolish or tuned off or closed off. We've forgotten what we've read about in the scriptures or experienced in our own lives in times past. So stop for a moment and consider. Christ is here. He's with you in the room. Lives in every church community, for after all, aren't we his body? Now we remember this for a moment, for a hot second, when we come together for an intimate conversation about the happenings 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. It's what we're doing still today, having our own conversation along the way, the road of life. Are you the only one who has not heard? And most of us have heard at least once or twice, so we come together and we listen, or we doze off, or we play games on our phones, or we forget in one fashion or another that Jesus is right beside us, taking part, adding his voice to the conversation in subtle ways. We take what goes on in Christian community for, many times, idle chatter, some crazy tale that has nothing to do with us, or some droning on of some preacher in a very boring way, or the singing of the same old song on repeat. Idle chatter, not homileu, not intimate conversation. But what if it is and we're missing it? Jesus guides us as we look through the scriptures, helping us understand what they say about who Christ is and how God has brought about one miraculous salvation after another. And sometimes, if we are listening very carefully, we are able to say with countless other disciples, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us along the way, while he was opening the scriptures, the stories about God to us? Then, at many churches, and perhaps most churches, we break bread. We pantomime what we just read about in this story of the time. We remember the time where Jesus took bread and broke it for us and ate it with his friends. And we hope that our own eyes will become open to the presence of Christ, who is, we believe, been there the whole time if we've been paying attention. And we call this communion because this meal is meant to symbolize these deeper truths that we're talking about. A profound intimacy that happens when people are restored to each other by the grace of Jesus. And in our times of communion in our churches, we break bread together. We commune in more than words, we hope. At least that is the hope, if we allow it. Our eyes should be opened, and we will see Jesus in the room, revealed in the stories about God, revealed also in the ones we sit beside in our pews. That same hand that touched the bread and the tray before you is connected to someone in whom the Spirit of Christ lives and is made alive. Like the disciples on the road, they couldn't see it. And in church, so often, we're sitting next to part of the body of Christ. Has Christ's DNA, made in God's image, and we forget in the humdrum doldrums of life. Seems that you've been walking with Jesus this entire time. It's time that we open our eyes and see it. See Christ, even in the mundane, in the unimpressive. But then communion is over. You know how this goes. The community disperses. We have small talk after the service, and it appears as if Jesus has left us, lost in the mundane until next week where we try to find a vision of him again. But the text just implies that the disciples could no longer see him. He vanishes. It doesn't say he left. The implication being he's still in some fashion with them. And in Matthew's gospel, it's put this way with the concluding words of Jesus before he vanishes in a similar way. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. And if this is true from where you now sit, Christ is in you and in the heart of those who surround you in love, and in the hearts of those you sit with around your dinner table as you commune in a non-churchy, very homey way. It's with you as you walk along the sidewalk next to a stranger who, if you had the eyes to see, is chock full of God's likeness and love, and you thought you were alone. If you had the eyes to see, Christ is in you and in the heart of those who surround you in love. And if you are afraid that help may not be on the way in these times, I encourage you, I challenge you to look around you and try to notice what may be right under your nose. Yesterday, as I was typing this sermon, my daughter, my 3-year-old, and this has happened to me repeatedly, but my 3-year-old this time comes up to me and she starts pawing at my knee, asking for me to attend to her, whilst I was hammering out a sermon in search of the Christ. And what I missed was God's presence as manifest in the image of God that my daughter carries with her, that is right in front of me, clawing at my knee. That's happened over the years many times with my eldest daughter, and I suspect it will happen again with all of my children, or my spouse, or my friends. As we walk along the way together, pondering the deep truths, communing in word and in action, we must do everything that we can do to not miss the Christ, the love, the goodness that is right under our nose.